Now that's significant. The Market Research Podcast.
Hi everyone, thanks for joining us on this latest episode of Now That's Significant, a market research podcast. This is your host Michael Howard, the Head of Marketing at Infotools. Today I'm joined by Victoria Sakal, the Head of Growth at Wanda. Victoria was a Grit Future List nominee a couple of years ago and has also spent time at Kantar and then Millward Brown before that. Thanks for joining us on the show, Victoria.
So excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. So what's the most significant thing you're going to share with us today?
Oh, lots of exciting topics we could cover, but I think probably the most timely one is some interesting insights and trends we were seeing in the research we just conducted. So a little bit meta, but wanted to take stock of how people are doing research, especially in this post-AI world.
Yes, yeah, we're navigating through that, and it's changing daily, isn't it? So,
absolutely, lots of things to keep in touch with and keep up on, but at the same time, it seems that the vote is also on some of these core pieces that are not going anywhere. There's some tried and true elements and first principles that I think we can be safe and sure will be sticking around.
Absolutely. So, can you tell us a little bit about this research on research, how it came about, the methodologies used, what kinds of people were involved, etc.?
Sure. So we had a pretty multifaceted approach. It include qual, quant, of course, secondary desk research. That's what we do here at Wonder. So couldn't skip that step. A bit of social listening, and then a number of different, sources and types of audiences. So we as much talked to our existing customers and looked at our own internal data as we monitored things like the information being provided to us when people book calls with us. We're collecting information on who they are and what their team is like and what their challenges and pain points are. Supplemented that with IDIs with both, again, existing customers and specifically non-customers. And then a big survey with similar stakeholders, but across different functions. So for us, because desk research is such a part of corporate strategy and corporate innovation efforts, we looked across a few different functions just to really understand, are they all similar enough? Are there nuances in their jobs to be done and in their pain points such that we should target a little bit more narrowly? But ultimately, we spoke with strategy, corporate development, even some marketing, but really more so product marketing, UX, traditional research and insights, and then, kind of standard innovation or innovation strategy roles to understand, again, what are people using to get research done? And that's across all of those different types I just mentioned, primary, secondary, everything in between. What are the biggest challenges with getting research done and doing it well? How and where do they ideally use research in their workflows, even if there's some sort of bandwidth or cost or feasibility challenge that doesn't let them? And where is there room for opportunity to make their overall, insights gathering or knowledge gap closing experience more efficient, more effective, especially as we think about AI coming onto the scene and where there isn't comfort with using tools that either are AI led or include AI as part of their solution.
So I guess this was taking market research as more of a function rather than a specific team and how it operates across the organization end to end.
Exactly. People, there's a lot of, which I love, being a researcher who, you get kind of a stigma with being in market research, but it actually is everybody's responsibility to stay smart on your category, on your competitors, on your audience and whatnot. So yeah, loved that this in particular did open the aperture a bit.
Yeah, true. So did you find any patterns across high-performing teams, whether that be processes, tools, structures, that might perhaps have contributed to the success?
Yeah, a few different pieces definitely bubbled up. The first is a very healthy rigor around what is the question we're trying to answer and in light of what we're trying to achieve. So you can often get a random question and just run after it. But sort of taking a step back to make sure you're asking the right question in order to lead you down the right path. That can mean as much who is the stakeholder who's asking and what does right look like to them, as are we phrasing this correctly, as are we even thinking about this problem or opportunity space in the right way? And do we need to maybe reframe the question we're asking? The second bucket is, we talk about it in terms of sort of the stack and the types of tools or platforms or research partners that these different companies are using. The best ones are really using a healthy mix of all of them. And I want to dig into this quickly in that it's not about having a lot of budget or a massive team and using all of the things. It's about appreciating that primary quant and primary qual and secondary and behavioral insight and product data all have something to contribute to this conversation. When you think about, kaleidoscope or a, rich, strong fabric, it's not just one of those things. And the strongest teams really appreciate that it's sort of multidisciplinary in the types and the sources of insights that you're gathering. And the last piece is sort of on the workflow front, where we talked about the people side, we talked about the process side, but when it comes to the tools and the technology you might be using, and how all these pieces all then come together, there's quick ad hoc questions that teams are actually asking and are actually exploring versus we don't have time for that. We don't have, the energy to get this question answered, like, thanks for asking so-and-so, but, come back to us in Q3 when we might have breathing room. There's an ongoing healthy drumbeat of we're staying smart on this space, that, just because we're not heavily focused on a competitive teardown or landscape right now doesn't mean we're going to put our blinders on and not pay attention to what else is happening outside our four walls. And then the third bucket are these bigger projects where we know we need to do a full maybe messaging audit before we launch our new product and make sure we're doing something that's standing out and meaningfully unique or different to our audience. But across those three different sort of like cadences and vectors, we're seeing that strong teams are doing all three versus operating too short-term, too long-term, too fixed and set in a plan, too fluid and all over the place. There's a healthy mix of all of them.
Yeah, I mean, the whole overload, let's just push it down the road, is something that we commonly hear in terms of our engagements. Did you come up with any ways that helped, shortcuts, I guess, to overcome some of that overload and actually help people get onto the path quicker because they know that there are those benefits for them to realize, some short-term, but definitely long-term as well?
The two pieces that really stuck out were, first, there's a workflow, or almost like I hate using the word process because it feels so processy, and it's less about, submit your request and we'll, get back to you in 24 hours. But if there's a way that you can receive ideas or questions or inquiries and handle them versus like it's going in backlog with like the last 6 months of questions, and again, come back to us in Q3, there's a way to like receive and hear and be able to act on those questions. The other piece, which is obviously where we're hyper tuned in, is how do you remove the barriers that make it so hard to get an answer to one of those quick questions? Again, your boss can come to you asking about this new competitor, and have you heard of them and should we care about them? And, whether you're a product marketer or a researcher or whatnot, your mind sort of goes like, oh, shoot, now I got to go Google them. I got to read all these different articles. I got to get a roundup of what people are saying about them. I got to understand, what did they just talk about in their most recent social appearances or press releases or thought leadership, and are they inkling towards something that we also are about to release, or something that tells us that they're a direct competitor? All of that is kind of important. You don't have to go really, really deep in the weeds, but you kind of need this broad, sweep of the space. But to do that correctly, you're either opening 150 tabs on Google, and then you're checking which are accurate, and then you're down rabbit holes of links within those articles. You're getting something back from an LLM, but again, you're like, is this real? Am I asking the right questions? Where are your sources? Oh, this source is a totally made up link. Oh, this one is from, 2003 and not more recent. So you have to put in a lot of legwork, and all that to say we're actively focused on how do you remove the barriers to getting the answers so that people are not afraid to just ask the quick questions and get the answers, and then you make a decision. Pay no attention to this competitor, add them to the pile to due diligence when we get to our competitive teardown. But it becomes part of a seamless workflow instead of like, shoot, we're off the tracks again.
No, absolutely. I like the point that you made, the first part of the three, which was just setting up the question, the outcome that you're wanting to, the answer that you're looking for. If you do that work right, and that doesn't necessarily involve an agency or a third party, it's internally as a business, getting that work right at the start will decrease the likelihood of rework or additional work that you do as well, and therefore remove some of the overwork as well.
Yeah, there's a really interesting principle in aviation that I've talked about a lot and we think about a lot, that being off by 1 degree at your starting point can lead you to be off by, I don't know, something like a mile after, 60 miles of travel, whatever the specifics of the numbers are. It's more to say getting the question right up front at least sets you on the right trajectory, or having the right information, so better answers to better questions, puts you on a better trajectory, versus you get some hand wavy thing from Google or a totally fake thing from an LLM. You're, very far off from where you should be by the time you're 2 months down the road. So yeah, it's about that kind of like level of fidelity and precision that you need, which you don't always have to be perfect early on. Sometimes it is about divergent thinking and just general senses of things, but knowing what your level of confidence has to be, and then having a tool that can get you to that level or beyond that level, is still more of a challenge than it probably should be.
Absolutely. And we've touched on this already. Technology is always evolving. It's not like AI has only been active since GPT burst into the scene a couple of years ago. With that in mind, were you able to identify any gaps or challenges people face in terms of the types of technology that is available today?
We focused a bit more specifically around attitudes towards an adoption of AI. I think what became abundantly clear as we asked about all the different types of tools available across any type of research, across any stage of your, research journey or innovation journey. There are certain tools everyone's using. There are certain tools people are generally more familiar or happy with. But when it comes to AI, the comfort with adopting them is as much a function of their own persona, whether, I don't think anybody is questioning now, is this an NFT thing that's going to go away in a year and I don't need to bother learning about it? But it's sort of like, should I learn it now? Are things going to change so much that in 2 weeks I'm going to be behind anyway? Does my company have a policy on it? Are there certain things I can or shouldn't even be using? And then where that starts to translate is with the tools, primary or research or otherwise, that are using AI. Is it a shiny object? Is it lipstick on a pig? Is it just jamming AI into some element of the experience to say we have AI? So the verdict is definitely, and we actually asked at IIEX, which Green Book hosts, I know you mentioned Grid at the start. We asked a number of different research professionals, how do you feel about AI? What's your one word? And we got the whole gamut. There's a lot of excitement, optimism, there's a lot of potential, but right now it's not there. It's not great. It's not already, meeting my needs. It's sort of like, it's early days. We'll see how it'll play out.
Yeah, sure. So what were some of the hesitations that you uncovered when it comes to AI usage and market research? Were there any in there beyond what we're commonly hearing now?
The biggest ones were actually more comments around where AI versus humans will best interplay, and to give some tangibility to that. What do I do with this information? How do I connect this with internal data? How do I think about this recent trend in the context of this new product that I'm thinking about that is not anywhere publicly available for an AI to mine? Sort of the critical thinking and the strategic applications, and the taking it from all the dots, all the what, all the data, to actual insights and the so what and the now what and the actual actionable decisions that can come out of all the information, is where sort of that like long tail and home stretch of doing something with all this information it feels like still the main concern, but also a place where AI can only be so helpful. Now it can get you there much faster. You're not having to do all the legwork and waste all the time and energy to get all those dots collected, but the human component of being able to like figure out how this applies and what do I do with this information, and how do I apply it in a way that will make language sing with our audience, or make a product that actually will solve a real need versus just fill some random arbitrary white space. That's kind of like the nuance and the magic and the niche that humans still fill, and feels like that's the commentary around, AI is great for this whole smattering of things, but only gets weaker and weaker as you move towards this whole smattering of things.
That's right. Another good thing to keep in mind is when you're served up with an answer, an output from AI, like what questions are you asking of that answer? And did you come across any questions or responses to AI outputs that the market's using or taking at the moment?
Well, I will say from my own experience, there's everything from, is this right? And it'll quibble and give me 180-degree different answer. And I was like, I was just confirming. I wasn't saying it was wrong and make the case of the opposite. There's, prompting it to be creative with, thinking of even different words for things, and it'll give you 16 of the same word back. So there's just a little bit of like, it's not quite entirely there yet. I think, some of the other comments and observations we've seen from people are where and how can it help me mine all of the research that I'm collecting across all of these different sources. So now we're talking a little bit more internally. How can it connect these qual interviews I did in January with this customer advisory board recording from last week with some of the product analytic data to do. Again, it's not going to necessarily come back with a strategic plan for me to tackle in Q2 or Q3, but it is going to maybe draw some connections for me. The whole other bucket I'll comment on is the synthetic data space, and where there's, I guess, the inclination to use basically the average of what people have said publicly and have those be your survey respondents or have those be your focus group participants, not hearing a whole lot of, I feel like jury is generally still out there leaning towards skepticism, but we'll see how that space evolves. Maybe there's potential.
Yeah, that was one of the heated topics, debates, I guess, at our local or our National Research Association conference this year. And one of the big proponents for it was ask it a question you know the answer for, and then you can gauge to see how accurate it is. And I guess that was to your point, like, if you already know the answer, AI is likely to know it as well. But what if it's something you don't know the answer for? How accurate is that going to be? And yeah, how it kind of resolves that and pushes it out is going to be an interesting journey to watch.
100%. And we think about it in an interesting analogy to desk research, in the sense of, you don't go to desk research by definition, existing publicly available information to find, the answer to what you should launch or, what you should do. But it is absolutely an essential input to collect sort of the known knowns. Like, this is your foundation point. So you might start with synthetic data to say, you're basically having a conversation with a chat bot format of desk research, right? Saying, like, how do people feel about a given topic, or what's people's receptivity to XYZ? And you get it maybe more on a single consumer respondent level, but it is not going to be the source of innovation and disruption and white spaces, because it is by definition things that exist. Like, you still have to use your intuition and experience to figure out where is the opportunity, given what is already known and publicly published and available.
That's a good way to think about it. So I guess there's the negative sides of AI and what people are worried about, but how about if we flip that to the positive side of things? What are some of the hopes that researchers have regarding AI?
It primarily comes down to the time being saved on things that, cross our minds as there has to be a better way. There has to be a more efficient, effective way. The kind of good thing about all of this is, I mentioned before, strategic thinking and, critical thinking and what do I do with this information? That's what most professionals are trying to get more time to do anyways. I mean, forget about like time boxing your calendar. You're like, oh, I gotta, review all of these Google responses so that I can figure out what to do with the information. The art of, or the act of digging through Google is not what people went to school for and like dreamt of doing for their career, right? And so when you think of where AI applies, it's eliminating a lot of that piece of the day job and helping people get, again, back to the strategic, forward-looking, actual, impact driving work. So that is, far and away when people talk about it, it helps me analyze, it gets me started with ideas, it provides interesting content directions. It's not usually as great as copy paste and I'm done. But it gets me to a place where I'm starting faster, I'm starting with more on hand, and I'm basically starting from like 70% instead of 0%, which means I can go to 200% instead of be tapped out because of time, energy, budget, whatever, at the 100% mark. So it's an augmentation, I think. It's the 1 + 1 = 3 situation.
Mm. Yeah, I guess there's also the endorphins that come from when we let our curiosity go run wild. Like we find a thread and we start pulling on it, and that thread's obviously a lot more advanced down the line as well if we do get that foundation, I guess, with AI.
That's our favorite part of it, that it really is reigniting that muscle that a lot of us as adults, you just grow away from curiosity, either because you had the right answer, you had to have the right answer in school, or your parents told you to stop asking so many questions, or it just became really hard. You could have a lot of ideas, but you don't have time to explore them all on the day job. Like you might think of this new, I don't know, angle around a product launch, and it's just not easy to explore questions historically, but now you can have a conversational interface with something that helps get the question out of you. We spend a lot of time, or have spent a lot of time developing our clarification engine, is how we think about it. Like it asks questions back. It helps you think through better questions. So you're not only getting back into having curiosity, you're kind of building your muscles at the gym to get better questions and think even further. And then, as you said, because you're getting answers quicker, better, faster, you can kind of keep pulling that thread farther than where you might have had to tap out in prior years.
Mm. So if we reflect back now on the research stack or the ecosystem of apps and software that the insights teams use across the end-to-end process of market research, what can you share in terms of platforms that were either mission critical versus nice to have?
One thing I was proud to see is that effectively all organizations are using internal data, which is important. It sounds like the most obvious sentence in the world, but if you have data on how people are using you or what they're telling you or how they're engaging with you, to leverage the heck out of it. I mean, and I don't just mean look at it every now and then. I'm thinking of all the feedback I'm sure airlines get that they don't act on. Like leverage it. That is definitely, it came up that's definitely, a kind of key arrow in everybody's quiver. We also saw the two other buckets were primary research in some form. Most companies are doing now. Again, we were talking to the larger, call them Fortune 500 or FANG type organizations. There's a little bit more of a challenge and friction involved in this, typically with smaller companies where you just think it's expensive and slow and hard. And so you don't necessarily opt into doing primary research. You call it 10 customer conversations and like, we think we got the insights we need. And then the third bucket is literally 99% of corporate America is using Google. So I don't know if that's makes it mission critical. I don't know if that just means it's probably there's a lot of opportunity for figuring out a better tool than, again, opening up 150 tabs and spending your time down the rabbit holes. But yeah, it really does come down to those couple of very fundamental pieces. The research stack is not changing in terms of like the variables, but the actual tools that you might use to do primary, secondary, or even mine your own internal data, that will obviously only continue to involve more data that it's pulling from in the first place, but also get smarter as AI can take on more of the load.
Absolutely. Now, you also mentioned earlier on the fundamentals are not changing. And I guess that will give some market researchers a nice sigh of relief. Like you need to work on those and keep them sharpened, I guess. And one challenge I guess you'll see with newcomers into the industry, they may see all these shiny toys and run at them, but then they don't necessarily have the experience to fall back on some of the fundamentals and then bring those through the process as well. Did the research at all bring up any of this to light?
When talking, especially in the qualitative conversations with people in the trenches, what people who've really been doing the work and appreciate the fundamentals seem to express was basically a version of what you just summarized, that there's new tools, there's new ideas, or there's, I mean, even some of these very structural and classic problems, like we're always restructuring and then people will have new ideas and then we have to figure out how to implement, the new strategic direction for our, as much as our research as our strategy. But I think it really just comes down to, who are we serving? What do they need help with? Where are we playing? Who else is playing there? And how do we, show up differently against them? And all of that then rolls into how do we win, which is as much business model as it is, price points and differentiation and positioning and supply chain and all the semantics of how you make something happen. And it came up time and again in the research that asking those questions and covering that type of research, because we also asked about not just how you do your research, but what topics are you actually covering ground on? Those things are just truly fundamentals. It's like 5 C's, 4 P's types of things. You can call them any version of the alphabet that you want to, and you can execute them with now any proliferation of shiny object A and incredible AI B. But at the end of the day, you still need that information to make a good decision, let alone a strong strategy.
That's right. I guess there are some things like crafting questions, for instance. Like a lot of that can be automated now as well. So you can even have a bank of questions too, which helps because you definitely don't want to get into that leading space of trying to force your opinions or your narrative on a particular survey, etc. as well.
Yeah, absolutely. But there's, when you think about the skill sets and what is evolving, and there is something to be said for, again, right, if we're talking about interviewing synthetic respondents, there's the fundamental pieces of doing research well, and then there's the tactical execution. You're still going to have to probably evolve your approach a little, the same way when during COVID, all of this qual research went online. The fundamentals are still there. You're trying to extract insights out of human respondents and participants, but the actual tactics might evolve. So just to say it's not all about, go back to the 1950s and how they did research is all we needed to know. But when you think about why you're doing research, that piece is not changing.
No, for sure. And the last point I want to touch on, and it's something that we're a big firm believer in at Infotools, is getting the research and getting the process, I guess, out to as many stakeholders in the business as possible, because they're all sitting with their knowledge of the customer, of the business, and involving them in the process can really help enrich in the outcomes that you can achieve, I guess, with the market research. So were there any points on this collaboration in terms of how market researchers can work better with stakeholders to improve outcomes?
The interesting angle that came up about this as we did our research is we sort of mapped across the broader workflow of going from initial idea or business remit all the way down to the product or solution is launching, where different functions and stakeholders either owned or spend some of their time or influenced. And there's some pieces where certain people own, obviously, marketing, right? They're end of that funnel. They're about getting it out into the world. But they're also ideally involved. They have insights on the market and the voice of the customer and the opportunity area for differentiation early on. Product is going to be heavily focused on development, but they have to be involved early on and they have to be informing the marketing. So all to say that across this full ecosystem, there is no scenario where just one team needs to know and that's it, and everybody else can just ignore whatever insights getting surfaced. Now, to your question, as far as the best way to share and democratize and really socialize that insight, the answer probably isn't keep everybody involved through every single step. But I think it heavily depends on stage and size of the company, and then kind of role and respect is the word that's coming to mind, but it's more like esteem of the different, research function, where if you're you have your engine going and you can easily socialize, here's the latest finding, or here's a recap of the videos or whatever. It kind of depends. Maturity is probably the better word to say, a more mature researcher insights engine we'll also probably have more budget and bandwidth to be able to spin out recaps of this or key findings from that. But I think what I heard was as long as there's a place where people can go to learn more if they're interested, and ideally, this is the bigger piece, ideally there's a culture and a real impetus to do that. That's where the sharing will become really helpful. Obviously, you can drown in endless amounts of data files and recordings and data sets. But I know, even when I'm sharing our recaps of our research across our organization, the trust is there that everybody knows that there's something that will inform their work, and that it wouldn't be shared if it wasn't worth their time to listen and kind of spend some time with. And that's just where, going back to your culture of curiosity point before, the appetite for insights and being data driven, not data change, but being data driven, and then using your intuition and expertise, that seemed to come up quite a bit.
Yeah, cool. So anything that we haven't touched on, or do you feel that we need to just to cover again before we close?
I think we covered everything.
Very nice. It's been a really interesting conversation, and thank you so much for sharing, for doing the research in the first place as well, because these things are always important to do, and researchers don't always have the capacity to carry out and conduct or be participate in research as well. So I appreciate what you've been able to do, and thanks for sharing the thoughts.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I'll say, even as someone who's been in this space for over a decade now, research can feel really intimidating. It can feel like it's going to be slow, it's going to be expensive by the time we're done. The organization is chomping at the bit to see results yesterday, which doesn't mean that even if it's a week turnaround, it can still feel slow. But at some point, you've got to do it, because then you've got the results. And I mean, even for us, we did our first really big research push with this effort, and now just the clarity and alignment and confidence that you get versus we're having conversations, we generally know what we should be doing, and we think from random ideas that pop up here and there that we should maybe experiment. You just get so much more confidence, and have the data as a launch pad. It doesn't have to be, again, the chain or the constraint, but gives you a lot of confidence. So if you can make it happen, there's a lot of agile, creative ways. I talk about that a lot in my own content, but always going to be advocating for more research.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us on the show, Victoria.
Thanks for having me. It was a great conversation.
You're welcome. And thanks to everyone who's listened in today. If you have liked what you've heard, please feel free to subscribe to the podcast, share it with others who else might find it interesting, and leave a review as well, so others can find the podcast too. Until next time, thanks for listening to Now That's Significant.